Hello and welcome. You are now listening to the Literature and Drama Podcast featuring Mr. Sebastian and Mr. Oscar Werner. In this podcast, we'll discuss the post-war literature and drama during the 1950s.
The Second World War had a rather large influence on literature and drama. Over 9 million injured soldiers were shipped home after the war. This inspired American authors to change their topic of writing. They stopped writing about prosperity and began to write novels with a naturalistic theme about post-traumatic stress and the horrors of war. They began to focus on the individual soldier instead of soldiers as a unit. They criticized the war and how it influenced the soldiers, both physically and mentally. An example is The Naked and the Dead, written by Norman Mailer in 1948. This novel challenges the ethics of war by presenting it as ineffective. In the novel, soldiers are also presented as machines, which shows that war has made them lose their human side. He literally describes them as dehumanized.
Because of the Second World War, people weren't as engaged in the great political fears. The war made people focus more on the psychological issues which the war had caused. Generally, it was shown through literature that people were uncomfortable because of the war. Therefore, many writers tried to find themselves through literature among other things. A few writers with black and/or Jewish American backgrounds tried to do this by reviewing their racial and cultural history. One of these were J.D. Salinger.
J.D. Salinger, a Jewish American author who became famous in the time period where it was very popular to criticize the modern mid-century society. Many Jewish authors began to use self-criticism and irony, which was new to literature. J.D. Salinger often chose the teenager as the main subject for his writings. He wrote about adolescence and an attempt to appeal to a younger audience. Many think that there is another reason to it. They believe that he spoke for adolescents and virtually to them through his literature. He used the language of the adolescent, which was particularly honest. By doing this, he made the teenagers realize their judgments towards the world.
Literature wasn't the only thing affected in the post-war society. It also had an influence on dramatists in the 1950s. In the American post-war society, there were two main dramatists, Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller. In many of Tennessee Williams' plays, he describes people who do not fit into any groups and are therefore isolated from their families and/or society. It seems that Williams saw life as a game which couldn't be won. These topics were recurring in many of Williams' plays. Arthur Miller's plays are different to those of Tennessee Williams. For example, in the plays All My Sons and The Crucible, Miller creates consequences for characters who disregard their social responsibilities. The Crucible specifically was also a very relevant play at the time. Even though it was set in the 1600s, it still had a significant relevance to the Red Scare in the 1949, which was the scare of a push-button war. This concludes the epic podcast about post-war literature and drama, brought to you by Mr. Sebastian and myself, Mr. Oscar Werner.